Section 20 of the Shagganappi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Celeste Law. The Shagganappi by E. Pauline Johnson. Gunshy Billy. No, sir, not for me, Bert Cooper was saying. I won't join the crowd if Billy is going. Do you fellows suppose I'm going to have my holiday all spoiled and not get any game, all because you want Billy? He's no good on a hunting trip. I tell you, he's gun shy. That's so, said another boy. I seen him stop his ears with his fingers when Bert shot his gun off more than once, too. Ought to be named Gussie, said Bert. A great big fellow like Billy? Scared of a gun? He must be 16 and large for his age at that. He's worse than that dog I had last year. Don't you remember, boys? He'd follow us for miles through the bush, raise game, point a partridge all right, and the second we shot a gun off, no more dog. All you'd see was a white and tan streak with its tail curled under it, making for home. Well, said Tommy McLean, a boy who never spoke until all the rest had thrashed the subject out. I'd rather see a fellow gun shy than see him a bally idiot with firearms. I know when I got my gun, I had a lesson with it. Father gave it to me himself when I was 14 last year. I never saw him look so serious as when he put it in my hands and said, Tom. He always calls me Tom, not Tommy when it's in earnest. Tom, he said, a gun is a good thing in the right hands and a bad thing in the wrong. A boy who is careless with a gun is worse than a born idiot. A boy that in play points a gun, loaded or unloaded, at any person, place, or thing, should be and often does land in prison. A gun is made for three things only. The first, to shoot animals and birds for food alone, not for sport. The second, to defend one's life from the attack of wild beasts. And the third, to shoot the tar out of the enemy when you are fighting as a soldier for your sovereign and your flag. Bully for Tom's father, yelled Bert. I hate being lectured, but that sounds like good common sporting sense, and we'll try to stick by it on this hunting trip. They were a nice lot of boys, all jolly, sturdy, manly chaps, who, however seldom, included Billy Jackson in their outings, for every holiday seemed to find him too busy to join them. For notwithstanding his unfortunate fear of a gunshot, Billy had always been a great lover of a uniform. As a youngster, he would follow the soldiers every parade day, not for the glory of marching in step to the music of the band, but for the chance it gave him to throw back his shoulders, puff out his small chest, and blow on his tin pipe whistle in adoring imitation of the bugler. He thought there was nothing in the world so important as the bugler. Billy thought it did not matter that the shining little trumpet merely voiced an officer's command. The fact always remained that at the clear, steady notes, the soldiers wheeled to do his bidding, that the bugler was a power for courage or cowardice, whichever way a boy was built. Then, as he grew older, he too began to practice on a bugle. He would sit out on the little side veranda, early and late, tooting every regimental call he could remember, until the time came when his perseverance met with reward. He actually found himself installed as the bugler to the little regiment of smartly uniformed men that was the pride of the gay Ontario city that Billy called home. Then it was that the other boys never got Billy on a holiday. When Victoria Day came, the soldiers always went into camp for 3 days. Strict military discipline reigned, and Billy must be with his company. When Dominion Day arrived, the regiment always visited some distant city to assist in some important patriotic celebration. Thanksgiving Day always found them in the thick of annual drill, and there was sure to be a sham battle, at which poor Billy had to toot the commands, his eyes blinking and the nerves chasing themselves up and down his back, while the blank cartridges peppered away harmlessly, and the field pieces roared innocently past his ears. The boys usually came with throngs of citizens to see the sham fights. They would range themselves on a slope of hills, as near as possible to the battlefield, and often, above the bellowing guns, above the colonel's command, above his own shrill bugle call, Billy could hear Bert Hooper and Tommy McLean egging him on, sometimes with jeers, sometimes with admiration, telling him to look up, Plucky, now. Billy, don't stop your ears with your fingers. He used to be astonished at himself that he cared so little whether they teased or cheered him. He seemed to care for nothing in all the world but the colonel's voice and his bugle. Then the day came when he knew there was something greater than the colonel to be obeyed, something dearer than a bugle to be proud of. For many weeks the newspapers had teemed with little else but news of the South African War. Nothing was talked of in all Canada, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, but the battles, the hardships, the privations of the gallant British regiments in the far-off enemy's country. Then came the cry, wrung from England's heart to her colonies, "Come over and help us!" Canada, Australia, New Zealand sprang to their feet like obedient children, ready and anxious to fight and die for their mother at her first call. Billy and his father faced each other. One was 16 and the other 40. They did not stand looking at each other, father and son, but as man and man. "Billy," said his father, "you don't remember your mother. She died while you were still a baby. If she were living, I would not hint of this to you. But I go to South Africa with the very first Canadian contingent. You are the best bugler in Canada. What do you want to do?" For an instant, Billy was speechless. His nerves shook with the boy's first fear of battle. His old gun shyness had him in its grips. Then his heart swelled with the pride aroused by his father's words. He raised his head, his chin, his eyes, and suddenly his look caught a picture hanging in its deep gold frame on the wall. It was a picture of a little, old, gray-haired woman, a sad-faced old woman dressed in black and wearing a widow's cap. It was a picture of Queen Victoria. Then Billy's voice came. "I can't remember ever having heard my mother speak, but," pointing to the picture, "she has been calling me ever since the war began. I know I'm only a big kid, and I can't fight with the men, but I can bugle, and Dad, you and I will go together." Once more they looked at each other as man to man. Then Billy's father shook hands with him, a hard, true, clinging shake, and without a word left the room. Oh, what a day it was for the little city when the picked men of the regiment marched in their khaki uniforms, halting at the railway station for all the last goodbyes before the train pulled them out eastward to board the transport ships that swung so impatiently in the Halifax harbor. The whole town was at the station, every boy in the place shouting and cheering and wishing he were grown up, were clad in khaki, were shouldering an Enfield rifle, and were going to fight for the Queen. When it was all over, Bert and Tommy stood watching with straining eyes the fast disappearing train. Handkerchiefs and caps and hands were waving from every window, faint snatches of cheers and the tune of "The Girl I Left Behind Me" came floating backward, but the boys only saw a small blotch of khaki color on the rear platform of the train, and a brilliant point of light where the golden Canada sun flung back its reflection from a well-polished bugle. They watched that light growing less and less in the distance until it finally faded like a setting star. Weeks afterwards, the newspapers rang with the glory of it all. The fame and the bravery of the Canadian regiments at the terrible battle of Purgaburg was known to all the world. Bert and Tommy and the rest of the boys devoured every line that touched on that wonderful fight, but their pride fairly broke bonds when in the great city papers they read this description. Throughout the thickest of the fight, a small but noticeable figure held his ground like a rock. It was a stocky little Canuck bugler, whose life seemed almost charmed, so thickly did the Boer bullets pepper about him, leaving him absolutely unhurt. "That's Billy!" they shouted hoarsely at each other. "Billy, as sure as you're alive!" Then they fairly covered the town with the news, gathering all the boys together in one big rejoicing crowd, telling each other over and over again the story of the battle, and joining in the monster parade, carrying banners, flags, lanterns, and torches to give honor to Canadian pluck and patriotism. And then, one day, a train came steaming and roaring into the station. The thronging crowds, the gay flags, the merry bands, and the ringing cheers were a welcome greeting for the little knot of war-worn men who had fought so loyally for Queen and country. The stocky little Canuck, as everyone now called Billy Jackson, was almost the last to alight from the train. He looked terribly shy and bashful at the uproarious reception he got, but he stood erect in his faded and patched old khaki uniform. His battered bugle still flashed back the sunlight, and his hand grip was as firm as his father's as the boys crowded up yelling, "What's the matter with Gunshot Billy? He's all right." But even as they cheered and welcomed him, Billy's eyes grew strangely odd-looking. The shyness and the smile seemed to sink out of them. His glance had caught sight of a slender, black-draped figure standing far back from the welcoming crowd, the figure of a young woman whose fingers clasped the chubby hand of a boy about 3 years old. For an instant Billy stood voiceless, his eyes staring, his mouth twitching nervously, his hands rigid and icy. Come on, fellows!" shouted the boys as the crowd surged closer about him, and friendly hands seized him by arm and shoulder, but he moved not a step. "Why, what's up, Billy?" exclaimed a dozen excited voices. "Come on! The carriages are waiting to start the parade. The band's getting in line. Hurry up! Hurry up!" Then Billy spoke. His voice came, shaking, as in the old gunshot days. But quietly as he spoke, the words seemed to reach across the whole station platform. "Boys, oh boys, there's poor Jack Morrison's wife, and his little laddie sent his love to." The crowd hushed its gay clamor, and every head turned towards the woman in black and the chubby child. They stood quite alone, silent, white-faced, weary. Jack Morrison was the only one who had not returned with the brave little band of soldiers who had set forth so valiantly months before. "I saw him fall," said Billy hoarsely. "Fall. Shot in a dozen places. For a moment, boys, I think I failed to bugle. I dropped on my knees and raised his poor face out of the dust. 'Billy,' he said, 'Billy, when you get home, give my love to my wife and my little buddy.' Then he just seemed to sink into a heap, and I sprang up to commands. Boys, through the rest of that fight, I could see nothing but Mrs. Morris's white face, hear nothing but her sobs. Oh, the misery of it all. I seemed to grow into an old man all at once. I could see myself coming home, and all of us here cheering, but not Jack Morrison." No one spoke. A vast silence fell, and the cheering ceased. Then Billy walked quietly through the crowd, and standing beside the white-faced widow, picked up the child in his strong young arms. He was not used to babies, and looked awkward and stiff and terribly conscious. Then he pulled himself together. "I have a message for you, Mrs. Morrison, and for this little chap here. I'll come and see you tomorrow, if I may, when all this fuss and flag waving is over." The woman looked blankly at him, with eyes that seemed watching for something, something that never came. Billy dared not trust himself to say another word. He finally set the child down and turned away. In a few minutes, the procession was in full swing, Billy and his father in one of the carriages, being driven beneath arches and banners and handclaps on all sides. Somehow, he got through that uproarious day smiling, but shy as usual. But when night came, he was tired and utterly undone, and turned in early. But sleep would not come. Then he arose and crept to his little bedroom window, standing there a long, long time alone in the dark, thinking how glorious it all had been. The glad, loyal faces of his boy friends, the magnificent welcome home. If only they could have brought Jack Morrison back home. Oh, Billy would have given up all the glory, the music, the cheers, the banners, to get away from the haunting memory of a woman's white, suffering face and black-robed figure, and the feel of the clinging hands of a tiny fatherless boy. His eyes did not see the homely street at his feet, the dying rockets and fireworks glaring against the sky. He saw only a simple grave in the open field in far-away Africa, a grave that he himself had heaped with stones formed in one word, Canada. At the recollection of it, poor Billy buried his aching head in his hands. The glory had paled and vanished. There was nothing left of this terrible war but the misery, the mourning, the heartbreak of it all. End of section 20.
Section 21 of the Shagganappi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Shagganappi by E. Pauline Johnson. Tekahionwake. The Brotherhood. "What is this silver chain for, Quita?" asked the boy, lifting the tomahawk. Footnote. The tomahawk and avenging knife spoken of in the story are both in the possession of the writer, the knife having been buried for 73 years on the estate where she was born. End of footnote. And running the curious links between his thumb and fingers. I never saw one before. The Mohawk smiled. That is because few tomahawks content themselves with times of peace. While war lives, you will never see a silver chain worn by an Iroquois, nor will you see it on anything he possesses, she answered. Then it is the badge of peace? Questioned the boy. The badge of peace, yes, replied Quita. It was a unique weapon which the boy fingered so curiously. The tomahawk itself was shaped like a slender axe, and wrought of beaten copper, with a half-inch edge of gleaming steel cleverly welded on, forming a deadly blade. At the butt end of the axe was a delicately shaped pipe bowl, carved and chased with heads of animals, coiling serpents and odd conventional figures, totems of the once mighty owner, whose war cry had echoed through the lake lands and forests more than a century ago. The handle was but 18 inches long, a smooth, polished stem of curled maple, the beauty of the natural wood heightened by a dark strip of color that wound with measured, even sweeps from tip to base like a ribbon. Quita had long ago told the boy how that rich spiral decoration was made, how the old Indians wound the wood with strips of wet buckskin, then burnt exposed wood sufficiently to color it. The beautiful white coils were the portions protected by the hide from the flame and smoke. Inlaid in this handle were strange designs of dull-beaten silver, cubes and circles, and innumerable hearts, the national symbol of the Mohawks. At the extreme end was a small, flat, metal mouthpiece, for this strange weapon was a combination of sun and shadow. It held within itself the unique capabilities of being a tomahawk, the most savage instrument in Indian warfare, and also a peace pipe, that most beautiful of all Indian treasures. "It is so strange," said the boy, fingering the weapon lovingly. "Your people are the most terrible on the warpath of all the nations in the world, yet they seem to think more of that word peace and to honor it more than all of us put together. Why, you even make silver chains for emblems of peace like this," and he tangled his slim fingers in the links that looped from the lower angle of the steel edge to the handle. "Yes," replied Quita, "we value peace. It is a holy word to the red man, perhaps because it is so little with us, because we know its face so slightly. The face of peace has no fiery stripes of color, no streaks of the deadly black and red, the war paints of the fighting Mohawks. It is a face of silver like this chain, and when it smiles upon us we wash the black and red from off our cheeks, and smoke this pipe as a sign of brotherhood with all men." "Brotherhood with all men," mused the boy aloud. "We pale-faces have no such times, Quita. Some of us are always at war. If we're not fighting here, we're fighting beyond the great salt seas. I wish we had more of your ways, Quita, your Indian ways. I wish we could link a silver chain around the world. We think we are the ones to teach, but I believe you could teach us much. Will you not teach me now? Tell me the story of this tomahawk. I may learn something from it, something of Indian war, peace, and brotherhood." "The story is yours to hear," said the Mohawk, "if you would see how peace grows out of deeds of blood, as the blue iris grows from the blackness of the swamp. But it is the flower that the sun loves, not the roots, buried in the darkness from which the blossom springs. So we of the red race say that the sun shines on peace alone, not the black depths beneath it. The Mohawk paused and locked his hands about his knees, while the boy stretched himself at full length and stared up at the far sky beyond the interlacing branches overhead. He loved to lie thus, listening to the quaint tales of olden days that the Quita had stored up in his wonderful treasure house of memory. Everything the Indian possessed had associated with it some wild tale of early Canadian history, some strange half-forgotten Indian custom or legend. So he listened now to the story of the last time that the ancient Indian law of a life for a life was carried out in the beautiful province of Ontario, while the low, even voice of the Mohawk described the historical event, giving to the tale the Indian term for the word peace, which means the silver chain that does not tarnish. This was the tomahawk of my grandsire, who had won his eagle plume by right of great bravery. For had he not, at your age, just 15 years, stood the great national test of starving for 3 days and 3 nights without a whimper? Did not this make him a warrior with the right to sit among the old men of his tribe, and to flaunt his eagle plume in the face of his enemy? Okwaho was his name. It means the wolf, and young as he was, like the wolf he could snarl and show his fangs. His older brother was the chief, tall and terrible, with the scowl of thunder on his brow and the gleaming fork of lightning in his eyes. This chief thought never of council fires or pipes, or hunting or fishing. He troubled not about joining the other young men in their sports of lacrosse or snow snake, or bowl and beans. To him there was nothing in life but the war path, no song but the war cry, no color but the war paint. Daily he sharpened his scalping knife. Daily he polished his tomahawk. Daily feathered and poisoned his arrows. Daily he sought enemies, taunted them, insulted them, braved them, and conquered them, while his young brother Okwaho rested in their lodge listening to the wisdom of the old men, learning their laws and longing for peace. Once Okwaho had said, "My brother, stay with us. Wash from thy cheeks the black and scarlet. Thy tomahawk has 2 ends. One is an edge, dyed often in blood. But show us that thou hast not forgotten how to use the other end. Fill thy pipe." "Little brother," replied the chief, "thou art yet but a stripling boy. Smoke then the peace pipe, but it is not for me." Okwaho felt this to be an insult. It was a taunt on his bravery. He squared his boyish shoulders and, lifting his narrow chin, flung back the answer, "I too can use both ends, the edge as well as the pipe." The great chief laughed. "That is right, little brother, and some day the tribe will ask you to show them how well you can use the edge. I shall not always be victor. Some day I shall fall, and my enemy will place his foot on my throat and voice the war cry of victory, just as I've done these many days. Hast thou sat among the wise men of our people long enough to learn what thou must do then, when the enemy laughs over my body?" "Yes," replied the boy. "I am thy nearest of kin. Indian law demands that I alone must avenge thy death. Thy murderer must die, and die by no hand but mine. It is the law." "It is the law," echoed the chief. "I can trust you to carry it out, eh, little brother?" "You can trust me, no matter how great a giant thy enemy may be," answered the boy. "Thy words are as thy name," smiled the chief. "Thou art indeed worthy of thy eagle plume. Thou art a true Okwaho." Then, placing his scalping knife in its sheath at his belt, he lifted his palm to his lips. A long, strange, quivering yell rent the forest trails, a yell of defiance, of mastery, of challenge. His feet were upon the war-path once more. That night, while the campfires yet glowed and flickered, painting the forest with black shadows against which curled the smoke from many pipe bowls, a long, strange, haunting note came faintly down on the wings of the water. The dark river, whispering past, bore on its deep currents the awful sound of the death cry. "Some mighty one has fallen," said the old men. the victor is voicing his triumph from far upstream. Then, as the hours slipped by, a runner came up the forest trail chanting the solemn song of the departed. As he neared the campfires, he ceased his song, and in its place gave once again the curdling horror of the death cry. "Who is the victor? Who the fallen brave?" cried the old men. "Thy chief, this hour hunts buffalo in the happy hunting grounds, while his enemy, Black Star of the Bear Clan, sings the war song of the great unconquered," replied the runner. "Ah, ha," replied the old men. "Okwaho, here, is next of kin, but this stripling boy is too young, too small to face and fight Black Star. But the law is that no other hand but his may avenge his brother's death. So our great dead chief must sleep while his murderer sings and taunts us with his freedom." "Not so," cried the young Okwaho. "I shall face Black Star. I shall obey the law of my people. My hand is small but strong, my aim is sure, my heart is brave, and my vengeance will be swift." Before the older men could stay him, he was away, but first he snatched the silver chain from off his tomahawk, emptied the bowl of tobacco, destroyed all the emblems of peace, and turned his back upon the council fire. All night long he scoured the forest for his brother's slayer. All night long he flung from his boyish lips the dreaded war cry of the avenger. And when day broke, he drank from the waters of the river and followed the trail that led to the lodge of his mighty enemy. Outside the door sat Black Star of the Bear Clan. Astride a fallen tree he lounged arrogantly. His hands, still red with last night's horrors, were feathering arrows. His savage face curled into a sneer as the boy neared him. Then a long, taunting laugh broke over the dawn, and he jeered. "So, pretty maiden boy, what hast thou to do with the great unconquered?" "I am the brother of thy victim," said Okwaho, as he slipped his tomahawk from his belt, placing it on the low bark roof of the lodge in case he needed a second weapon. "The avenger, eh?" scoffed Black Star mockingly. "The avenger, yes," repeated the boy. Then, walking deliberately up to the savage warrior, he placed his left hand on the other's shoulder, and facing him squarely said, "I'm here to carry out the law of our people. Because I'm young, it does not mean that I must not obey the rules of older and wiser men. Will you fight me now? I demand it." The other sneered. "Fight you?" he said disdainfully. "I do not fight babies, or women. Thou hast a woman's wrist. A baby's fingers, they could not swing a tomahawk." "No?" the boy sneered. "Perhaps thou art right, but they can plunge a knife. Did thou not lend my brother a knife last night? Yes? Then I have come to return it." There was a flash of steel, a wild death cry, and Okwaho's knife was buried to the hilt in the heart of Black Star of the Bear Clan. Kwita ceased speaking, for the pale-faced boy lying at his feet had shuddered and locked his teeth at the gruesome tale. "But Kwita," he said after a long pause, "I thought this was a story of peace, of the silver chain that does not tarnish." "It is," replied the Indian. "You shall hear how peace was born out of that black deed. Listen." When Black Star of the Bear Clan lay dead at his feet, the centuries of fighting blood surged up in the boy's whole body. He placed his moccasined foot on the throat of the conquered, flung back his head, and gave the long, wild Mohawk war cry of victory. Far off that cry reached the ears of the older men, smoking about their council fire. "It is Okwaho's voice," they said proudly, "and it is the cry of victory. We may never hear that cry again, for the white man's law and rule begins today." Which was true, for after that the Mohawks came under the governmental laws of Canada. It was the last time the red man's native law of justice, of blood for blood, was ever enacted in Ontario. This is history, Canadian history, not merely a tale of horror with which to pass this winter afternoon. Again Kwita ceased speaking, and again the boy persisted. "But the silver chain?" With a dreamy, far-away look, the Indian continued. One never uses an avenging knife again. The blade even must not be wiped. It is a dark deed, even to an Indian's soul, and the knife must be buried on the dark side of a tree, the north side where the sun never shines, where the moss grows thickest. Okwaho buried his blood-stained knife, slipping it blade downwards beneath the moss, took his unused tomahawk and returned to his people. The red man's law is ended, he said. Yes, we must be as white men now, replied the older men sadly. That night Okwaho beat into this handle these small silver hearts. They are the badge of brotherhood with all men. The next day white men came, explaining the new rule that must hold sway in the forest. If there is bloodshed among you, they said, the laws of Canada will punish the evildoer. Put up your knives and tomahawks and be at peace. And as the years went on and on, these ancient Indian customs all dropped far into the past. Only one thing remained to remind Okwaho of his barbarous boyish deed. It was the top branch of a tall tree waving above its fellows. As he fished and paddled peacefully miles up the river, he could see that treetop, and his heart never forgot what was lying at its roots. He grew old until he reached the age of 89, but the treetop still waved and the roots still held their secret. He came to me then. I was but a boy myself, but his grandson, and he loved me. He told me this strange tale, adding, Quita, my feet must soon travel up the long trail. I would know what peace is like before I go on the journey. Come, we will unearth the knife. I followed where he led. We found the weapon 3 feet down in the earth where the years had weighted it. In places the steel was still bright, but in others dark patches of rust covered the scarlet of Black Star's blood. Fresh 73 years before. It is yours, said Okwaho, placing it in my hand. See, the sun shines on it. Perhaps that will lessen the darkness of the deed. But I obeyed the Indian law. 73 years this knife has lain buried. It was the last law. The last law. That night Okwaho began to hammer and beat and mold these silver links. When they were finished, he welded them firmly to the tomahawk, and just before he went up the long, long trail, he gave it to me, saying, This blade has never tasted blood. It will never have dark spots on it like those on the knife. The silver chain does not tarnish, for it means peace and the brotherhood of all men. Quita's voice ceased. The tale was ended. And peace has reigned ever since? Asked the boy, still looking at the far-off sky through the branches overhead. Peace has reigned ever since, replied Quita. The Mohawks and the Palefaces are brothers under one law. That was the last avenging knife. It is Canadian history. End of section 21, read by Czandra, questioningly. Section 22 of the Shagganappi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Shagganappi by E. Pauline Johnson. The Signal Code. Ever since Billy Ellis had been a little bit of a shaver, he had played at railroad. Not just now and again, as other boys do, but he rarely touched a game or a sport before he would ingeniously twist it into a pretend railroad. Marbles were to him merely things to be used to indicate telegraph poles, with glass and agate alleys as stations. Sliding downhill on a bobsleigh, he invariably tooted and whistled like an engine, and trudging uphill he puffed and imitated a heavy freight climbing up grade. The ball grounds were to him the Y at the junction, the shunting yards, or the turn bridge at the roundhouse, for Benny's father was an engineer who ran the fast mail over the big western division of the new road, where mountains and forests were cut and levelled and tunnelled for the long, heavy transcontinental train to climb through. And in his own home the boy heard little but railroad talk, so he came by his preferences honestly. "Well, Benny, been railroading today?" his father would often ask playfully, on one of the 3 nights in the week when he was home, with the grime of the engine coal-oiled from his big hands, and his blue over-jeans hanging out behind the kitchen door. "Yes, Daddy," the youngster would begin excitedly, and climbing onto the arm of his father's chair, he would beat his little heels together in his eagerness to get the story out in speech, and proceed to explain how he had built a pretend track in the yard, with curves and grades, over which his little express cart ran bully. And round the curves we just signal to the other train and have whistles with real meanings to them, like a really big train. "Oh-ho! Getting up the signal system, are you now?" his father would grin. "Why, you'll be big enough and wise enough soon to come on number 27 and wipe the engine or fire for Daddy. Won't that be nice?" Then the big man would set the chubby child of 6 years down on the floor to play, as he winked knowingly at Benny's mother, who nodded a smiling reply. But it did not take many years to make Benny a pretty big boy, and one of the boy kind who always start schemes and devices among their schoolfellows. He seemed to be a born leader, with a crowd of other boys always at his heels ready to follow where he ventured or to mimic what he did. No one ever walked ahead of him. No one ever suggested things to do or places to go when the engineer's son was around. He was always the vanguard, but fortunately was the kind of boy who rarely, if ever, led his followers into trouble. Finally, someone nicknamed him the Con, as short for conductor, for he still played at railroading and had long since decided that when school days were over he would go as a train hand, and perhaps be lucky enough to be sometimes in his father's crew. It was about this time, when Benny was 12, that he invented the signal code, and more than once it got the gang out of serious trouble. The little divisional town where he lived was shut in between hills so closely that it was a veritable furnace in summer, and all who could went out camping or built shacks on the 3 islands in the little lake 2 miles farther down the track. So Benny and his little brother and sister went with their mother to join some neighbors camping, and Dad would come down on a handcar on off nights to get a breath of air and the coal dust blown out of his keen eyes. It did not take the shrewd engineer long to discover that the boys on the islands had a signal code. One would stand on his boat landing and wave a strip of white cotton into a lot of grotesque figures, and far off on another island some other boy would reply with similar figures, and after much talking the various boys would act with perfect understanding, either meeting out on the lake in the boats or going swimming or building campfires. It did not matter much what they decided upon, but after these signals they all worked in unison. And one night something happened of real import. It was just sunset one beautiful August day, and Mr. Ellis, wearied with a long, hard run, lay drinking in the wild beauty of the lonely lake, with its forest-covered shores and its rocky islands. Over on the mainland the Mackenzies' camp gleamed white in the sunset. One could discern every movement in the clear air, although the tents were a full mile, if not more, from where the wearied engineer lay, grateful for the stillness after hours of the heated convulsions of the great steed he drove, day after day. "There go the Mackenzie boys for a swim, Benny," called out his father. "Too bad you're not with them, but you and I'll go in together here, if you like." "All right, Dad," answered Benny, leaving his fishing tackle to watch his young neighbors. "Then, say, the boys have a dandy beach there. I wish ours was as good. The only trouble is you got to swim round that big rock to it. There's no climbing over it, and there's only one resting place on the way, but we always go. It's great. See, Dad, there they go," as the 2 white gleaming young bodies plunged into the lake. No sooner were they well out than right at the base of the rock and along the very beach they were heading for came stealthily and ponderously a huge black bear and 2 woolly cubs. Straight for the water's edge they padded their way, then stood drinking endlessly. "Great Caesar, Benny, look, look!" yelled Mr. Ellis, standing upright and rigid. The Mackenzie boys are heading right round that rock. They'll head on right into that she-bear." Benny stood perfectly voiceless, paralyzed with the sight. The animals savage with heat and thirst. They always are when they have cubs along, and here are those naked boys making straight for her. Then he sprang to his feet, yelling at the top of his lungs, "Take care! Go back! Go back!" But the boys still swam on. They either could not hear him, or else his voice carried no warning. "Quick, Benny!" he shouted. "Get my revolver on the shelf. I'll get the boat out. We must go to help them. They're dead boys as sure as anything." But Benny had found his tongue and his wits. "There they go, climbing on to the resting place. They'll stay a second there, But at that instant he broke off, and dashing into the shack, seized the white tablecloth, scattering the supper dishes far and wide. With a rush he was at a point of rock which the dying sun flooded with a brilliant red light. In this radiance the boy stood, swinging about his head the white cloth until it circled 5 times, then dropped to his feet. Seizing it again, he held it at arm's length in his right hand, then dexterously tossed it over his head and caught it in his left. "Oh, I wonder if they see me," he cried shakily, then once more went through the signals. A faint, far whistle reached his ears. Then, in a weakness of relief, he dropped down on the rocks, shouting, "They'll never budge, Dad. They understand." But Mr. Ellis was already in the boat, revolver in hand, and 3 seconds later he and Benny were pulling for all they were worth towards the shivering swimmers who crouched on the resting place, unconscious of why they must remain there or what danger threatened. Very little was said until Benny and his dad had them safely in the boat and had rowed them round the rock and pointed silently at the bear and cubs, which still lapped the water at the edge of the beach. As she caught sight of the boat, the mother growled sullenly, and her red tongue dripped saliva as she started for them until she was breast high in the water. But strong arms pulled the boat out far beyond danger, and the tragedy that might have been was averted by a boy's invention and quick wit. It was very late when the Ellis family had supper that night, but Mrs. Ellis did not mind the broken and scattered dishes when she saw what a rescue Benny had accomplished. They all talked until they were tired, just as the Mackenzie boys talked at their camp. Later Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie rowed across the lake in the dark to tell their gratitude to Benny and his father. But Mr. Ellis would have none of it. "You just owe it to Benny here," he laughed. "But what he did with that white tablecloth beats me." "That's part of my signal code," said the boy, a little shyly. "I invented it. It's our Scout Society code, but I don't mind telling you, after all this, that 3 circles of any white cloth above one's head means danger, 5 circles means great danger, and a toss from one hand to the other up through the air means don't move, stay where you are." "Well, I never knew that child's play would save my boys' lives," said Mr. Mackenzie gratefully. "I knew these kiddies had some fool code they played at, but this beats me as well as you." "It's no fool code, friend Mac," answered the engineer. "It's what an engine whistle or the swing of a lantern is to us trainmen, and I'm glad our boys play at something so sensible. It's a mighty good thing once in a while, as we saw today, this signal code." It was late in September when the little colony on the lake struck camp and pulled into town. The hunting season was well on, and sportsmen were out after deer and partridge, and Benny and his friends had been fortunate enough to shoot 2 birds and a jackrabbit. This, of course, meant that every Saturday they took to the woods with the one little shotgun the crowd possessed, for in the wild new railway districts it is a good thing for boys to learn to be good shots while yet young. Often in the snowbound winters meat is scarce, and one's food is frequently the result of being a dead shot, so guns in the hands of boys of 10 and 12 are nothing unusual. One wonderful autumn day 6 of the gang had prowled the forest for hours, and had succeeded in bagging some plump partridges, and late in the afternoon they all sprawled out in the Indian summer sunshine, finishing the remnants of their luncheon and looking about the marvelous cavern that, formed by the pine-crowned hills, lay like a cup at their feet. In and out wound the railroad track, a lonely, isolated bit of man's handiwork, threading through the vastness of nature. It was the only sign of human life visible until, after a long lazy hour, Benny sat up, staring with round eyes into the valley below. A thin scarf of blue smoke was indolently curling up from a spot apparently in the forest. He called the attention of the boys to it, and for want of something else to do, they lay and watched it. Presently a puff arose more rapidly, then another. "That's a real fire, sure enough," said Benny. "Bet you it'll burn among the timber for a month this dry season." "Doesn't look among the timber," said another boy. "Looks as if it was along the track." "Let's go down there and see," said someone else, and forthwith the gang scrambled to their feet, grabbed their gun and ammunition bag and birds, and proceeded to slip and slide and scramble down the steeps until a half hour brought them to the railroad, along which they ran towards the direction from where they had seen the smoke. They ran through a big cut, rounded an abrupt curve, and dashed right into a cloud of smoke, while the crackle of flame spit and sparkled, bringing them up short with speechless horror. The huge wooden railroad trestle spanning Whitefish Creek was in flames. For an instant the entire gang gazed at it numbly. Then a boy yelled, "Great Scott, fellows, isn't it good there's no train due? She'd plunge round this curve right into it." Then Benny went white. "Who's got a watch?" he asked very quietly. "My Ingersoll says 5:15, and she's right, too," replied Joe Mackenzie. Benny gulped. He seemed to find a difficulty in speaking, but the words finally came. "My dad went down to Gray's Point to bring up a special tonight, the divisional superintendent's private car and some fast freight. They're due about now." "Thanks be, Gray's Point is this side of the trestle. We can stop them," shouted Joe, and without argument the gang turned, tearing at a breakneck pace round the curve and through the cut, in a hopeless effort to make their hometown before the special reached it. Breathlessly they ran for 10 minutes, stumbling along the sleepers, recovering and forging ahead, until cutting the evening air came a long, thin whistle, and immediately afterwards the black nose of an engine and a ribbon of smoke rounded a distant curve, and came bearing down on them at the rate of 45 miles an hour. The gang paused, standing rock still for an instant. Then 5 of them danced up and down, waving their arms wildly to signal the train to stop. But the 6th boy, Benny Ellis, white as a sheet, was tearing madly at his collar and dragging off his coat. Then, quick as a flash, he skinned from his narrow shoulders his blue cotton shirt, faded almost white by the summer suns, and dashing down the track towards the oncoming engine, whirled it high above his head in 5 distinct circles, while his young voice, hoarse with a frenzy of fear, shrieked, "Father! Father! Oh, Dad! Try to remember! Try! Try!" And from the cab of the great mogul, Engineer Ellis was peering out with his keen eyes, piercing the track ahead, his hand at the throttle. "Jim!" he called abruptly to his fireman. There was something in his tone that made Jim fling himself to the window. Then both men exclaimed simultaneously, "It's a hold-up!" "There's 6 of them, and one's got a gun," gasped the engineer. "We'll have to crowd on steam and rush 'em unless they've wrecked the track." Then, as the huge iron monster lifted itself to greater speed, Mr. Ellis saw something like a white flag wave in the air, then fall. Once more it circled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times above someone's head, fell again, then was tossed from one hand high in the air and caught in the other. "Jim, I've seen that signal somewhere. It means something." Then, like a photograph, he seemed to see a lake, 2 boys swimming, and a black bear and cubs on a far shore, while Benny's voice rang in his ears. 5 circles means great danger, and a toss from one hand to the other, up through the air, means don't move. Stay where you are. "It's the boys, Jim," gasped the engineer. "There's something wrong." Before the words had left his lips, the shrill whistle was shrieking for brakes, double brakes at that, and the gigantic engine almost leaped from the rails as the halter was thrown about her neck. On she rushed, slipping, grinding, rocking in her restraint. The train crew and passengers in the rear car pitched almost on their faces with the violent checking of speed, until, snorting and pulsing and belching, the great mogul came to a standstill. "Oh, Daddy, you did remember. You did, after all." cried a very white-faced little boy who peered up into the cab window with horrified eyes while his naked shoulders heaved and his hand clutched a torn, faded blue shirt. "What's the meaning of this nonsense, Alice?" thundered an angry voice behind him, and the superintendent, black with scowling, glared at first the boy, then the engineer. "What's this stop for, when you know I haven't a minute to spare before getting to Dubuque? You nearly broke my neck, too, downing brakes. What does it mean, I say?" But when the boys, bold with excitement, dragged the great man around the curve and pointed to the doomed trestle, with its already falling timbers, it was another story altogether. From the engineer's white lips he listened to the history of Benny's signal code. Then for a long time the great man stood looking at the burning trestle. Once he muttered aloud, "All our lives, a priceless engine, valuable freight, rolling stock, all saved." Then whirling rapidly on his heel, he said, "Ellis, we want your boy on the road when he's bigger. The boy who can invent a useful plaything and keep his head in an emergency is the boy we want to make into a man on the great transcontinental. Will you let us have him?" "Ask Benny what he wants to do," smiled the engineer. "Well, little signal code man, what do you want to do?" asked the superintendent. "Speak, old man." The boy was looking him directly in the eyes. "Go on the great transcontinental if I get the chance," he replied. "You'll get the chance, all right," said the superintendent. "I'll see that you get it. Ellis, you may back the train down into town now. There's lots to see to about reconstructing the trestle." And under his breath he added, "That's the sort of boy we want on the railroad. That's the sort of boy." End of section 22, read by Czandra, near Montreal, 2022. Section 23 of the Shagganappi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Shagganappi by E. Pauline Johnson. The Shadow Trail. A Christmas Story. Peter Ottertail was a full-blooded Mohawk Indian, who, notwithstanding his almost 80 years, still had the fine, thin features, the upright shoulders, and the keen, bright eyes of the ancient warlike tribe to which he belonged. He was a great favourite with Mr. Duncan, the earnest Scotch minister who had made a personal companion of Peter all through the years he'd been a missionary on the Indian Reserve. And as for the two Duncan boys, they had literally been brought up in the hollow of the old Indian's hands. How those boys had ever acquired the familiar names of Tom and Jerry, no one seemed to remember. They really had been christened Alexander and Stuart by their own father in his own church. Then Peter Ottertail had, after the manner of all Indians, given them nicknames, and they became known throughout the entire copper-coloured congregation as the Pony and the Partridge. Peter had named Alexander, alias Tom, the Pony, because of his sturdy muscular back and firm, strong little mouth that occasionally looked as if it could take the bit right in its teeth and bolt. And Stuart, alias Jerry, was named the Partridge because of his truly marvellous habit of disappearing when you tried to drum him up to go errands or carry wood. Fortunately for the boys themselves, they were made of the good stuff that did not mind nicknames and jests, and when at the ages of 10 and 12 they were packed off to school in a distant city, they were the very first to tell their schoolfellows Peter's pet names, which, however, never took root on the school playground. Tom and Jerry being far more to the taste of young Canadian football and lacrosse players. During the school terms, old Peter Ottertail would come to the parsonage every Sunday after church, would dine seriously with Mr. and Mrs. Duncan, and then, saying good-bye, would always shake his head solemnly and say, "I'll come no more until my Pony and Partridge come home." But the following Sunday saw him back again, and the first day of vacation was not hailed with greater delight by the boys than by their old friend Peter. The nearest railway station was 11 miles distant, but rain or shine, blood, heat, or zero, Peter always hitched up his own team and set out hours too early to meet the train. On arriving at the station, he would tie up his horses and sit smoking his black stone pipe for a long time. The distant whistle of the incoming train alone aroused him from rapt thought, and presently his dark old face was beaming on his boys, who always surprised him by having grown greatly during the term, and who made as much fuss and hilarious welcome over him as if Mr. Duncan himself had come to drive them home. So this delightful comradeship went on, year in, year out. The boys spent every day of their holidays in the woods or on the river with Peter. He taught them 1,000 things few white boys have the privilege of learning. They could hollow canoes, shape paddles, make arrows and feather them, season bows, distinguish poisonous plants from harmless ones, foretell the wind and the weather, the various moons, and the habits of game and fish, and they knew every tale and superstition on the reserve. One day, just before the Christmas holidays, old Peter appeared at the parsonage. Mrs. Duncan herself opened the door, smiling, sweet and a little younger looking than when he had seen her the previous Sunday. "Come in, Peter, come in," she cried brightly. "We're all in a turmoil, but happy as kittens. Tom and Jerry are coming to-morrow, and bringing 2 friends with them, nice boys from Jamaica, who are too far away from their home to return for Christmas. They've never seen snow in their lives until this winter, and we must all try to give the little fellows a good time, Peter. I'm busy already with extra cooking. Boys must eat, mustn't they?" "Yes, Miss Duncan," answered the old man slowly, "and these snow-seers will eat double in the north country. Yes, I'll go and fetch them with my big lumber sleigh and take plenty of buffalo robes and wolf skins to keep these children of the sun warm." Mrs. Duncan smiled. She could already hear Peter nicknaming the little chaps from Jamaica the Snow-seer and the Sun-child, in his own beautifully childlike and appropriate fashion, and she was quite right. Peter had hardly shaken hands and tucked the 4 boys snugly into his big bobsleigh before the names slipped off his tongue with the ease of one who had used them for a lifetime. Tom and Jerry had fully prepared their southern friends for everything. They had talked for hours with great pride of their father's devotion to his Indian congregation, of their mother's love for the mission, of the Indians' responsive affection for them, of the wonderful progress the Mohawks had made, of their beautiful church with its city-like appointments, its stained windows, its full-toned organ and choir of all Indian voices, until the Jamaica boys began to feel they were not to see any wild Indians at all. Peter, however, reassured them somewhat, for although he was not clad in buckskin and feathers, he wore exquisitely beaded moccasins, a scarlet sash about his waist, a small owl feather sticking in his hat-band, and his ears were pierced, displaying huge earrings of hammered silver. Yes, they decided that Peter Ottertail was unmistakably a Mohawk Indian. Tom and Jerry had never entertained any boys before, and after the first day at home they began to fear things would be dull for their friends at Christmas, who always spent such gay city holidays. They need not have worried, however, for the boys found too much novelty even in this forest home ever to feel the lack of city life. They of course fell in love with old Peter at once, and not a day passed but all 4 of them could be seen driving, snowshoeing, tobogganing, skating with the old Mohawk looming not very far distant. And as Christmas approached, with all its church interests, they swung into the festivities of the remote mission with all the zest that boys in their early teens possess. The young Southerners had never visited at a minister's house before, and at first they were very sedate, laughed not too loudly, and carried themselves with the dignity of little old gentlemen. But within a day they learned that because a man was a great, good, noble missionary, it did not necessarily mean that he must look serious and never enjoy any fun with the boys. Mr. Duncan always made it a rule that no house in existence must be more attractive to Tom and Jerry than their own home, and that it depended very largely upon their father as to whether they longed to stay in their own home and bring their young friends in too, or whether they longed to go outside their father's house to meet their playfellows. Needless to say that with such a father, Tom and Jerry had a pretty good time at home, and it was only what they expected when the day before Christmas, as all 4 boys were racketing around the kitchen and nearly convulsing Mrs. Duncan with laughter by their antics, while she tried almost vainly to finish cooking the last savoury dainties for the morrow, that Mr. Duncan should suddenly appear in the doorway and say, "Now, boys, tonight will be Christmas Eve. You know, in the heart of the forest we can't get much in the way of entertainment. And I don't want our young Jamaica friends to feel homesick for their beautiful southern country tonight, of all nights. I've racked my brains to think of some amusement after supper this Christmas Eve, but I seem to have failed. Can't you, Tom and Jerry, help me out?" There was a brief silence. Then, of course, the sweet, busy mother spoke. "Peter Ottertail and I have schemed together for that. I have invited him to supper, and we're to have a roaring fire built here in the kitchen, and Peter is to tell the 4 boys some Indian stories, while you and I, Father, finish the Christmas tree in the parlor. What do you think of my idea?" She need not have asked, for such a clamor of delight went up that her own words were drowned. "Excellent!" cried Mr. Duncan, when finally he could be heard. "Excellent, for we don't want you young mischiefs in the parlor at all, seeing your presence the day before, and the only one I know who could keep you out is Peter. Splendid idea of yours, Mary. Boys, it's these mothers who have the real Christmas things in their hearts." "Yes, and in the oven, too," laughed Mrs. Duncan, extracting therefrom a big pan of deliciously light cake, whose spicy fragrance assailed the boys' nostrils temptingly. "This," she continued, "is to be eaten here in the kitchen tonight. It goes with Peter's stories." "Jolly," said someone, and the 4 youthful voices immediately swung into "For mother's a jolly good fellow, for mother's a jolly good fellow, for mother's a jolly good fellow, which nobody can deny." And joining in the last line, there boomed a 5th voice, which sounded suspiciously like Mr. Duncan's. A crackling wood fire was roaring up the chimney from the large stove in the kitchen. On the spotlessly white pine floor were spread soft grey lynx skins, 1 or 2 raccoon skins with their fluffy ringed tails, and a couple of red fox pelts. On these sprawled the 4 boys in various and intricate attitudes. In the corner back of the stove lounged Peter Ottertail on a single brown buffalo robe. With a bit of sharp-edged flint he scraped tiny curls of shavings from a half-formed ashwood arrow, which from time to time he lifted even with one eye to look along its glimmering length towards the light, to see that it was straight and flawless, his soft, even voice warbling out the strangely beautiful Indian tradition of the Shadow Trail. "You young pale faces that are within my heart know well what a path through the forest is, or what a track across the valley means. But the Indian calls these footways a trail, and some trails are hard to follow. They hide themselves in the wilderness, bury themselves in the swamps and swales, and sometimes a man or a buffalo must beat his own trail where never footstep has fallen before. The Shadow Trail is not of these, and at some time every man must walk it. I was a very small, very young brave when I first heard of it. My grandsire used to tell me, just as I tell you now, of the wonder country through which it led, of the wise and knowing animals that had their lairs and dens beside it, of the royal birds that had their nests and eyries above it, of the white stars that hovered along its windings, of the small whispering creatures of the night that make music with their cobweb wings. These things all talk with a man as he takes the Shadow Trail, and the oftener they speak and sing to him, the higher climbs the trail, and if he listens long enough to their voices, he will find the trail has lifted its curving way aloft until it creeps along the summit of the mountains, not at their base. It is here that the stars come close and the singing is hushed in the great white silence of the heights, but only he who listens to the wise animals and the eagles and the gauzy-winged insects will ever climb so high. This is the Shadow Trail the wild geese take on their April flight to the north, as honking through the rain-warm nights they interweave their wings with the calling wind. They leave no footprints to show whither they go, for the northing bird is wise. This is the Shadow Trail that countless buffaloes thundered through when, hunted by the white men, they journeyed into the great unknown. Wise men who are nearing the height of the trail say they can hear the booming of myriad hoofs, and see the tossing of unnumbered horns, as the herds of bison yet travel far ahead. This is the Shadow Trail the northern lights dance upon, shimmering and pale and silvery. We Indians call them the dead men's fingers, though sometimes they pour out in great splashes of cold blue, of poisonous-looking purple, of burning crimson and orange. We speak of them as the sky flowers of the north, that scatter their deathless masses along the lifting way. And this is the shadow trail the red man has followed these many, many moons. His moccasined feet have climbed the heights silently, slowly, firmly. He knows it will lead beyond the canyons, beyond the crests, that behind the mountains it merges into a vast valley of untold beauty. We Indians call it the Happy Hunting Grounds. Only one person ever returns from the shadow trail, and he comes once a year on this night, Christmas Eve. The stars wake and sing as he passes. The sky flowers of the north surround him on his journey from the summits to this valley where we live. He is a little child who was born hundreds of years ago in a manger beneath the eastern stars in the land of morning. Many times I have met him on the shadow trail, for I have traveled towards its heights for nearly 80 years. Perhaps I shall see the little child again tonight, for Indian eyes can see a long way. Indian ears catch oftenest the singing of the stars, and the Indian heart both sees and hears. Peter Ottertail's voice ceased. The boys lay very silent, the soft fur rugs half hiding their rapt faces. No one spoke, for each was watching the shadow trail. Then the deep-toned clock struck 1, 2, 3, 4, evenly on to 12, midnight. The door opened from the inner hall. "Merry Christmas, dears! Merry Christmas!" came the hearty, loving voices of Mr. and Mrs. Duncan, as they bustled into the kitchen, the boys and Peter all scrambling to their feet to meet them. "Merry Christmas, and off to bed with the whole lot of you, or we'll have a nice pack of sleepyheads in the morning. Peter, you're surely not going home tonight," as the old Indian began to get into his overcoat and scarlet sash. "Yes," he said, "I'll go." And after gay good wishes and handshakes, the old man went out into the night, perhaps to watch for the Christmas child coming down the shadow trail. End of story. Read by Czandra, 2022. Section 24 of the Shagganappi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Shagganappi by Tekahionwake, E. Pauline Johnson. The Saucy 7. Probably Bob Stewart would never have been asked to join the camping party had he not been the best canoeist in the club. He was so much younger than the other half-dozen that composed the party that his joining was much discussed, but there were no two opinions about Bob's paddling, nor yet about his ability to pitch a tent, cast a fly, shoot small game at long range, and when you're far up north on a canoe cruise and have to depend on the forest and river to supply your dinner, you don't sneer at an enthusiastic fisherman or a good shot. So, one royal August day, Bob found himself on the train with 6 university graduates bound for up north for a glorious 3 weeks' outing. Their canoes, tents, and duffel were all stored away in the express car ahead. Their cares and their studies were packed away in the weeks left behind, their hearts as merry, their clothes as hideous as a jolly crowd of holiday-makers could desire. It was a long, hot, dusty railway journey, but at last the tiny northern railway station hove in sight. The rasping screech of the sawmill rivaled the shrill call of the locomotive, and directly behind the little settlement stretched the smooth surface of Lake Nameless, ready and waiting to be ruffled by the dip of paddle blades. It does not take long for 7 practical campers to get their kit and canoes in shape to pitch canvas for the night. And just as the sun dropped behind a rim of dense fir forest, the Saucy 7, as the boys had christened themselves, lighted their first campfire and hung their kettle for supper. The 2 tents were already up, white and gleaming against the lake line. The 3 cruising canoes were safely beached for the night. Blankets were already spread over beds of hemlock boughs, and the goodly smell of frying bacon arose temptingly in the warm, still twilight air. 7 hungry mouths took a long time to be satisfied, but the frying pan and the teapot were empty at last, and the boys ready to turn in early after their long journey and busy settling. The first night in camp is always a restless one. The flapping tent, the straining guy ropes, the strange wild sounds and scents seemed to prop your eyelids open for hours. The night birds winging overhead, the far laugh of loons across the waters, the twigs creaking and snapping beneath the feet of little timid animals, the soft singing of the pines above the canvas, these things get into one's blood, one's brain, and almost before you know it, the night is gone, and a whole chorus of song arises with the coming of day. There's nothing in all the world more enjoyable than tumbling from your blankets to unlace the flap of the tent, to fling it wide and step out into the soft grey world before sunrise, to swallow whole breaths of fresh sweet morning air, then to plunge into a still cool lake and drive sleep from the corners of your eyes as the winking sun drives night from the forest. Then another enjoyable thing is to have Tom, Dick, or Harry hustle about and get the kettle boiling and fish frying while you're yet plunging about like a frog, and by the time you've rushed ashore and into your shorts and sweater and wigwam shoes, the aforesaid pleasant persons have breakfast ready, and you come around just in time to make way with vast bowls of coffee and unlimited fish and toast. This is all very well if you have the whole lake and its outletting river all to yourselves, with no one to scare the fish and game and none to trespass on your campground. But picture to yourselves the consternation that assailed the boys when the following night the train brought in another camping crowd that trailed up the shore with a great deal of fuss and pitched camp directly across the point from them, a crowd of at least 10 men. No rollicking boys there, all big, full-grown men with beards and whiskers, with a dozen gun cases, stretcher camp beds, and some scarlet velvet rugs. Actually rugs. The boys just stood and stared, then sneered. "Nice saucy 7 those chaps will make of our holiday," groaned one of the grads. "Sorry, 7, we'd better call ourselves, I say, and tomorrow I'm for moving, striking camp at daylight and getting away from that gang that camps with rugs." The last word took on the expression of an article of actual disgrace. "Hello, they're running up the colours," interrupted Bob. "It's a Union Jack, all right. Perhaps they're not such rummies after all." Then, after much peering and squinting, they made out that the biggest tent stretched directly at the base of the flagstaff and contained the despised scarlet rugs, which the boys were still jeering at when they noticed a little canoe, singly manned, put out from the rocky ledge and make swiftly towards them. The saucy 7 unbent sufficiently to all go in a body to the landing. Their minds were fully made up to invite the intruder to shinny on his own side and not come moseying around their camp, when the canoeist beached his bow and sprang lightly ashore. He was a very handsome young man, clean-shaven and merry-eyed, and touching his cap lightly, he said in a tremendously English voice, "Beg pardon, gentlemen, sorry to trouble you, but His Excellency, the Governor-General, presents his compliments, and would you kindly lend him a can of condensed milk? Our cook seems to have forgotten everything. We haven't a drop for our coffee." The saucy 7 raised 7 disgraceful-looking caps, but only one spoke. It was the biggest grad. "Why, we're honoured. We had no idea who it was." "Oh, that's all right," answered the Englishman. "You know, His Excellency goes camping for a day or 2 every year, just for the fun, and fish and things." "Fish? Does he like fish?" asked Bob. Then, without waiting for a reply, he disappeared, only to return with a can of condensed milk and 3 splendid 4-pound bass that he had landed for their own supper. He looked shyly at the young aide-de-camp, handing him the can, and said, "Will you present our compliments to His Excellency and ask him to accept these for supper?" "Delighted, I'm sure," said the officer. "He's fond of bass. Thanks for the milk, gentlemen. Perhaps we can help you out some time." And in another minute the canoe was skimming away towards the point, where the Union Jack hung idly against a background of firs. But just before the Englishman was out of hearing, the big grad yelled, "Tell the Governor-General that the fish were caught and sent by Bobby." "All right," came faintly across the distance, with a wave of the smart little cap and a bright backward smile from the handsome Englishman. The saucy 7 looked at each other, then the big grad simply expressed things in one explosive, "Well!" "No, I don't think we'll move tomorrow, said one. Move from here, said another. Well, I'm a frazzle, added a third. The Governor-General of all Canada, gasped another. And borrowing milk from us, chimed in two more. No fish for supper, said Bob, and my fault too, but I'll get some for breakfast or my name'll be Dennis. And he did get fish for breakfast, which was evidently more than His Excellency did, for about sunset the following evening a guide came paddling over with a large square envelope directed to Mr. Bobby. Inside was this note, written in a small firm hand. Lord Dunbridge presents his compliments to Mr. Bobby, and thanks him for the enjoyable fish dinner tendered him last evening, and would Mr. Bobby kindly do him an additional favour? Would he come at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning to assist a poor fisherman who has had no luck to-day? That night Bob was a regular hero around the campfire. The boys sang, "He's a jolly good fellow," and a dozen other gay choruses, while Bob looked to his tackle and bait, and gathered all the courage he could muster to meet the great man in the morning. He need not have trembled. It was no ordeal, for as he paddled up to the big camp, a quiet-looking gentleman with an iron-grey moustache and kindly, genial eyes stepped down to the landing and held out his hand, and said, "Good morning, Bobby. I hope we shall be friends. I have been most unlucky. Not a fish yesterday. We'll have to do better than that, won't we?" "Yes, sir. Yes, Your Excellency," said Bob, slowly trying to get his nerves steady. "I'm afraid my guides are very little good," said Lord Dunbridge, as he carefully settled himself in the canoe. "They both profess to know these waters, but they don't seem to be able to find any good fishing pools." "I can do better than that," ventured Bob. "I've been around these lakes every summer that I can remember. If, Your Excellency, you don't mind, we'll paddle across to the outletting river. It's full of rapids, and below them we'll find fish." "Then we'll go there," replied His Excellency. For 1 whole hour the great man and the great fisherman had sport that a king might envy. Side by side they sat, or stood, baiting or reeling in the heavy gleaming bass, chatting, boasting, and eager for game. It was a great morning's catch. A dozen noble fish testified to their skill when the pair, overcome with hunger, were compelled to put up their rods and make for the camp and breakfast. "We have had a glorious morning, haven't we, Bob?" said the governor. "I feel like a boy again, a boy playing truant, a boy who has run away from his big school of politicians at Ottawa, just to get a few days fishing and oh, well, get away from it all." There was a brief silence. Then Lord Dunbridge continued, "Bob, you're a boy. So was I once, but I think you'll understand. You Canadian boys do seem to grasp things, some way or other. My boyhood was not quite as jolly as yours is, not so independent. You see, we always had tutors and things to look after us and keep us shut in, as it were, and I never knew, as I dare say you do, the pleasure of getting about by myself." And his voice trailed off as if he were thinking of something else. Suddenly he seemed to awaken, and removing his cap, let the keen morning air blow across his long fine hair, dark hair, touched about the temples with grey. Then he smiled down at the sunburnt boy at his side and said, as if he feared to be overheard, "Bob, I'd give $5 to be a boy like you today, and be able to run those rapids in a canoe. Would it be safe?" "I've done it 20 times, Your Excellency," said Bob eagerly, "and in this same old canoe here. I know every shoal, every rock, every bar in the river. Oh, sir, that is sport, the very best sport I know of." The spirit of the thing seemed to take hold of Lord Dunbridge. "Perhaps, Bob," he exclaimed with a dashing enthusiasm, "perhaps, Bob, some day you and I will—" "Yes, sir, I think I know," interrupted Bob, as the other hesitated. Then in a half-whisper, "I'll bring you through safely, sir, any time you want to go. And you quite understand, Bob, you are to say nothing about that canoe trip we're to have, don't you?" said His Excellency as they parted at the governor's landing. Bob lifted his cap, saying very quietly, "Very well, sir, no one shall know." Then he paddled slowly, very slowly away. His thoughts were busy. Here was he, Bob Stewart, an obscure boy from an obscure Ontario town, holding in common a secret with the Governor-General of all Canada, a secret that not even the Prime Minister at Ottawa knew. Then came the horror, the fear of an accident. Suppose something happened to the canoe? Suppose she split her bow on a rock? Suppose His Excellency lost his head and got nervous? Suppose 1,000 things. But Bob put it all resolutely behind him. He felt his strong young muscles, his vital fingers, his pliant wrists. Yes, it was a great thing to be a boy whose great pride has always been to excel in typical Canadian sports, to be the crack canoeist and to handle a paddle with the ease of a professional. It was worth everything in the world to recall the time when someone had tauntingly said, "Oh, Bob Stewart's no good at cricket and baseball. Why, he can't even play tennis. All he can do is to potter at his old Canuck sports of paddling a canoe and swinging a lacrosse stick." And Bob had laughed with satisfaction and said good-naturedly, "You bet. You're right. I'm for our national games every time." And now had come the reward. He was to run the rapids with the representative of the throne of Great Britain in the bow of his canoe. 2 days later came the summons, and early the next morning Bob was supposed to set forth again to take His Excellency fishing. The viceregal staff, aides, and guides saw them depart, never dreaming for a moment that they were really runaways bound for a royal holiday. Bob hardly realized it himself until at the head of the rapids they unshipped all unnecessary tackle and prepared to make the run. They hauled a big rock aboard, placing it astern to trim Bob's light weight to balance Lord Dunbridge's. "Now," said the boy, "when I yell for you to paddle port or starboard, you had better work for all you're worth, Your Excellency, or we may grind on the rocks." "Good," replied the governor. "You can depend on me, Bob." His Excellency knelt low on his heels forward of the bow thwart. Bob knelt high, with the stern thwart just catching his seat. He felt his strong ashen paddle carefully, stowed an extra blade. "Handy," said he. "Now then," and the little canoe shot out into the middle of the placid river. Far in the distance the rapids frothed and curled, their song rippling backwards like a beckoning hand. On either side fir forests crowded to the rocky edges that broke like cruel granite jaws against the waters. Immediately ahead the stream twisted into circles, those smooth, deadly circles that herald the coming tumult. Bob's strong young arms grew taut, their sinews like thin cords of steel. There was not a tremor in his entire body. He knelt, steady and calm, his keen narrow eyes fixed plumb ahead, alert and shrewd as an animal. He felt his fingers grip the paddle with a strength that was vice-like, grip and cling and command. The canoe obeyed even his thought, obeyed the turn of his smallest finger, obeyed, steadied itself, stood motionless for a second, then lifted its nose and plunged forward. The spray split in two, showering the gunwales, then roared abaft, and then they were in the thick of the fight. "Do you want me to paddle?" shouted back Lord Dunbridge. "No, I can pilot her all right," came the response through the wind that almost shrieked Bob's voice away. The rocky ledges of shores were crowding closer now. The firs, dark and melancholy, were frowning down. Sharp crags arose like ragged teeth to right, to left, ahead, and between them the river boiled and lashed itself into fury, pitching headlong on and on down the throat of the yawning channel. The tiny canoe flung between the rocks like a shuttle. Twice its keel shivered rabbit-wise in the force of crossing currents. Once, far above the tumult, came a wild, anxious voice from the shore, but neither Bob nor his passenger gave heed. The dash of that wildcat rapid left no second of time for replying or turning one's eyelid. It was one long, breathless, hurling plunge that got into their blood like a fever. Then presently the riot seemed all behind them. The savage music of the river grew fainter and fainter. The canoe slipped through the exhausted waters silently as a snake. A moment more, and the bow beached on a strip of yellow sand, secure, steadfast, triumphant. The glorious cruise was over. A little group of scared, white-faced men huddled together on shore, the handsome young aide-de-camp reaching down his eager hands, which shook with anxiety. "Oh, Your Excellency!" he exclaimed. "How could you run such a risk, with only this boy to pilot you?" "Bob and I ran away," said Lord Dunbridge, as breathless but happy he sprang from the canoe. "We ran away for a little holiday just by ourselves. I would not have missed it for the world." Then more seriously he added, "Gentlemen, if I could think that my Prime Minister and the government at Ottawa could steer the ship of state as splendidly as Bobby steered that canoe, I would never have another wrinkle on my forehead or another grey hair on my head." End of section 24. Read by Czandra, near Montreal, 2022.
Section 25 of the Shagganappi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Winifred Assman. The Shagganappi by E. Pauline Johnson. Tekahionwake. Little Wolf-Willow. Old Beavertail hated many things, but most of all he hated the Northwest Mounted Police. Not that they had ever molested or worried him in his far corner of the Crooked Lakes Indian Reserve, but they stood for the enforcing of the white man's laws, and old Beavertail hated the white man. He would sit for hours together in his big teepee, counting his piles of furs, smoking, grumbling, and storming at the inroads of the palefaces onto his lands and hunting grounds. Consequently, it was an amazing surprise to everybody when he consented to let his eldest son, little Wolf-Willow, go away to attend the Indian school in far-off Manitoba. But old Beavertail explained with rare appreciation his reasons for this consent. He said he wished the boy to learn English, so that he would grow up to be a keen, sharp trader like the men of the Hudson's Bay Company, the white men who were so apt to outwit the redskins in a fur-trading bargain. Thus we see that poor old Beavertail had suffered and been cheated at the hands of the cunning paleface. Little Wolf-Willow was not little by any means. He was tall, thin, wiry, and quick, a boy of marked intelligence and much ability. He was called Little Wolf-Willow to distinguish him from his grandsire, Big Wolf-Willow by name, whose career as a warrior made him famed throughout half of the great Canadian Northwest. Little Wolf-Willow's one idea of life was to grow up and be like his grandfather, the hero of 50 battles against both hostile Indian tribes and invading white settlers, to have 9 scalps at his belt and scars on his face, to wear a crimson-tipped eagle feather in his hair, and to give a war whoop that would echo from lake to lake and plant fear in the hearts of his enemies. But instead of all this splendid life, the boy was sent away to the school taught by pale-faced men and women, to a terrible, far-away, strange school, where he would have to learn a new language, and perhaps wear clothes like the white men wore. The superintendent of the school, who had persuaded old Beavertail to let the boy come, brought him out from the Crooked Lakes with several other boys. Most of them could speak a few words of English, but not so little Wolf-Willow, who arrived from his prairie teepee dressed in buckskin and moccasins, a pretty string of white elk's teeth about his throat, and his long, straight black hair braided in 2 plaits, interwoven with bits of rabbit skin. A dull green blanket served as an overcoat, and he wore no hat at all. His face was small and beautifully tinted a rich reddish copper color, and his eyes were black, alert, and very shining. The teachers greeted him very kindly, and he shook hands with them gravely, like a very old man. and from that day onward little Wolf-Willow shut his heart within himself and suffered. In the first place, the white people all looked sick to him, unhealthy, bleached. Then, try as he would, he could not accustom his feet to the stiff leather shoes he was induced to wear. One morning his buckskin coat was missing, and in its place was a nice blue cloth one with gleaming golden buttons. He hated it, but he had to wear it. Then his green blanket disappeared, a warm, heavy overcoat in its place. Then his fringed buckskin chaps went. In their place, a pair of dreadful gray cloth trousers. Little Wolf-Willow made no comment, but he kept his eyes and ears open and mastered a few important words of English, which, however, he kept to himself as yet. And then, one day, when he had worn these hated clothes for a whole month, the superintendent who had brought him away from his father's tepee sent for him to come to his little office. The boy went. The superintendent was so kind and so gentle, and his smile was so true, that the boy had grown somewhat attached to him. So, without fear of anything in the world, the little Cree scholar slipped noiselessly into the room. "Ah, little Wolf-Willow," said the superintendent kindly. "I notice that you are beginning to understand a little English already." The boy smiled and nodded slightly. "You are very quick and smart, my boy, quick as a lynx, smart as a fox. Now tell me, are you happy here? Do you like the school?" continued Mr. Enderby. There was a brief silence, then a direct, straight look from the small Cree eyes, and the words, "I like you, me." Mr. Enderby smiled. "That's good. I like you too, little Wolf-Willow. Now tell me, do you like your new clothes?" "No good," said the boy. Mr. Enderby looked grave. "But, my boy, that is what you must wear if you are to be educated. Do you know what the word education means? Have you ever heard the teachers or boys here use it?" "White man, English," came the quick reply. "That's it. You have described it exactly. To become educated, you must try and wear and do what the white people do, like the English, as you say." Mr. Enderby went on. "Now what about your hair? White men don't wear long hair, and you see all the Cree boys in the school have let me cut their hair. Wouldn't you like to be like them?" "No, hair good," said the boy. "Well, how about a white name?" asked Mr. Enderby. "The other boys have taken them. Wouldn't you like me to call you John?" "I'd like to." "Me Wolf-Willow, same grandfather," came in tones of pronounced decision. "Very well, little Wolf-Willow, you must do as you like, you know. But you said when you came in that you liked me, and I like you very much. Perhaps some day you will do these things to please me." Then Mr. Enderby added softly to himself, "It will all come in time. It is pretty hard to ask any boy to give up his language, his clothes, his customs, his old-time way of living, his name, even the church of his fathers. I must have patience, patience." "You speak?" asked the boy. "Just to myself," said Mr. Enderby. "I speak," said the little Indian, standing up and looking fearlessly into the superintendent's face. "I speak. I keep hair, good. I keep name Wolf-Willow, good. I keep skin, Indian color. I not white man's skin. English skin no good. My skin best, good." Mr. Enderby laughed. "No, no, little Wolf-Willow, we won't try to change the color of your skin," he said. "No good try. I keep skin, better skin than white man. I keep skin, me." And the next instant he was gone. Miss Watson, the matron, appeared at the door. "What have you done to little Wolf-Willow?" she asked in surprise. "Why, he is careering down the hall at a breakneck speed." "I believe the child thought I was going to skin him, to make a white boy out of him," laughed Mr. Enderby. "Poor little chap. I expect you wanted to cut off his hair," said Miss Watson, "and perhaps call him Tom, Dick, Harry, or some such name." "I did," answered the superintendent. "The other boys have all come to it." "Yes, I know they have, agreed Miss Watson. "But there is something about that boy that makes me think that you'll never get his hair or his name away from him." And she was right. They never did. It was 6 years before little Wolf-Willow again entered the door of his father's tepee. He returned to the Crooked Lakes, speaking English fluently, and with the excellent appointment of interpreter for the government Indian agent. The instant his father saw him, the alert Cree eye noted the uncut hair. Nothing could have so pleased old Beavertail. He had held for years a fear in his heart that the school would utterly rob him of his boy. Little Wolf-Willow's mother arose from preparing an antelope stew for supper. She looked up into her son's face. When he left, he had not been as high as her ear-tips. With the wonderful intuition of mothers the world over, she knew at the first glance that they had not made him into a white man. Years seemed to roll from her face. She had been so fearful lest he should not come back to their old prairie life. "Rest here," she said in the gentle Cree tongue. "Rest here, little Wolf-Willow. It is your home." The boy himself had been almost afraid to come. He had grown accustomed to sleeping in a house, in a bed, to wearing shoes, to eating the white man's food. But the blood of the prairies leaped in his veins at the sight of the great tepee, with its dry sod floor spread with wolf-skins and ancient buffalo hides. He flung himself onto the furs and the grass, his fingers threading themselves through the buckskin fringes that adorned old Beavertail's leggings. "Father," he cried out in the quaint Cree tongue, "Father, sire of my own, I have learned the best the white man had to give, but they have not changed me or my heart any more than they could change the copper tint of my skin." Old Beavertail fairly chuckled, then replied between pipe puffs, "Some of our Cree boys go to school. They learn the white man's ways, and they are of no more use to their people. They cannot trap for furs, nor scout, nor hunt, nor find a prairie trail. You are wiser than that, little Wolf-Willow. You are smarter than when you left us, but you return to us, the old people of your tribe, just the same as your father and grandfather." "Not quite the same," replied the boy cautiously. "For, father, I do not now hate the Northwest Mounted Police." For answer, old Beavertail snarled like a husky dog. "You'll hate them again when you live here long enough," he muttered. "And if you have any friends among them, keep those friends distant, beyond the rim of the horizon. I will not have their scarlet coats showing here." Wisely, the boy did not reply. And that night, rolled in coyote skins, he slept like a little child once more on the floor of his father's tepee. For many months after that, he traveled about the great prairies, visiting with the government Indian agent many distant camps and Cree lodges. He always rode astride a sturdy little buckskin-colored cayuse. Like most Indian boys, he was a splendid horseman, steady in his seat, swift of eye, and sure of every prairie trail in all Saskatchewan. He always wore a strange mixture of civilized and savage clothes: fringed buckskin chaps, beaded moccasins, a blue flannel shirt, a scarlet silk handkerchief knotted around his throat, a wide-brimmed cowboy hat with a rattlesnake skin as a hatband, and 2 magnificent bracelets of ivory elk's teeth. His braided hair, his young, clean, thin, dark face, his fearless riding began to be known far and wide. The men of the Hudson's Bay Company trusted him. The Northwest Mounted Police loved him. The white traders admired him. But most of all, he stood fast in the affection of his own Indian people. They never forgot the fact that, had he wished, he could have stayed with the white people altogether, that he was equal to them in English education, but he did not choose to do so. He was one of their own for all time. But one dreadful night, Corporal Manan of the Northwest Mounted Police rode into barracks at Regina with a serious, worried face. He reported immediately to his captain. "A bad business, Captain," he said, coming to attention. "A very bad business, sir. I have reports from old Scotty McIntyre's ranch up north that young Wolf-Willow, that we all know so well, has been caught rustling cattle. Cut out 2 calves, sir, and, well, he's stolen them, sir, and old Scotty is after him with a shotgun." Too bad, said the captain with genuine concern. "Young Wolf-Willow gone wrong. I can hardly believe it. How old is he, Corporal?" "About 16 or 17, I should say, sir." "Too bad," again said the captain. "Well educated. Fine boy, too. What good has it done him? It seems these Indians will cut up. Education seems to only make them worse, Corporal. He'll feel arrest less from you than most of us. You'll have to go. Start early at daylight and bring him into prison when you return." "I?" fairly shouted Corporal Menan. "I arrest young Wolf-Willow? No, sir. You'll have to get another policeman." "You'll do as you receive orders," blurted the captain. Then added more graciously, "Why, Menan, don't you see how much better it is to arrest him? Scotty is after him with a shotgun, and he'll kill the boy on sight. Wolf-Willow is safest here. You leave at daylight and bring him in if you have to handcuff him to do it." Corporal Menan spent a miserable night. Never had a task been so odious to him. He loved the bright, handsome Cree boy, and his heart was sore that he had gone wrong after giving such promise of a fine, useful manhood. But the white settlers' cattle must be protected, and orders were orders. A soldier must obey his superior officer. So, at daybreak, the fastest horse in the service was saddled, and Corporal Menan was hard on the trail of the young Cree thief. But little Wolf-Willow knew nothing of all this. Far away up the northern plains, a terrible bit of news had come to him. At the Hudson's Bay post, he had been told that his old grandfather had been caught stealing cattle, that the Northwest Mounted Police were after him, that they would surely capture him and put him in Regina jail. The boy was horrified. His own old grandfather a thief? He knew that old warrior well enough, knew that he was innocent of intentional crime, knew that, should the scarlet-coated police give chase, the old Indian would never understand, but would probably fire and kill the man who attempted to arrest him. The boy knew that, with his own perfect knowledge of English, he could explain everything away if only he could be at his grandfather's in time, or else intercept the police before they should arrest him. His grandfather would shoot. The boy knew it. Then there would be bloodshed, added to theft. But Big Wolf-Willow's lodge was 90 miles distant, and it was the middle of a long, severe winter. What was to be done? One thing only. He, little Wolf-Willow, must ride. He must not waste an hour, or the prison at Regina would have his grandfather, and perhaps a gallant soldier of the king would meet his death doing his duty. Thrusting a pouch of pemmican into his shirt front and fastening his buckskin coat tightly across his chest, he flung himself onto his wiry little cayuse, faced about to the northeast, and struck the trail for the lodges of his own people. Then began the longest, most terrible ride of his life. Afterwards, when he became a man, he often felt that he lived through years and years during that 90-mile journey. On all sides of him stretched the blinding white snow-covered prairie. Not a tree, not an object to mark the trail. The wind blew straight and level directly down from the Arctic zone, icy, cutting, numbing. It whistled past his ears, pricking and stinging his face like a whiplash. The cold yellow sunlight on the snow blinded him, like a light flashed from a mirror. Not a human habitation, not a living thing lay in his path. Night came, with countless stars and a joyous crescent of northern lights hanging low in the sky, and the intense, still cold that haunts the prairie country. He grudged the hours of rest he must give his horse, pitying the poor beast for its lack of food and water, but compelled to urge it on and on. After what seemed a lifetime of hardship, both boy and beast began to weaken. The irresistible sleepiness that forebodes freezing began to overcome little Wolf-Willow. Utter exhaustion was sapping the strength of the cayuse, but they blundered on mile after mile, both with the pluck of the prairies in their red blood. Colder, slower, wearier they became. Little Wolf-Willow's head was whirling, his brain thickening, his fingers clutching aimlessly. The bridle reins slipped from his hands. Hunger, thirst, cold, exhaustion overpowered both horse and rider. The animal stumbled, once, twice, then fell like a dead weight. At daybreak, Corporal Menan, hot on the pursuit of the supposed young cattle thief, rode up the freezing trail headed for the northeast. A mile ahead of him, he saw what he thought was a dead steer, which the coyotes had probably killed and were eating. As he galloped nearer, he saw it was a horse. An exclamation escaped his lips. Then, slipping from his own mount, stiff and half-frozen himself, he bent pityingly above the dead animal that lay with the slender body of an Indian hugging up to it for warmth. "Poor little chap," choked the corporal. "Poor little Wolf-Willow. Death's got him now, I'm afraid, and that's worse than the mounted police." Then the soldier knelt down, and for 2 long hours rubbed with snow and his own fur cap the thin frozen face and hands of the almost lifeless boy. He rolled the lithe young body about, pounding it and beating it, until consciousness returned, and the boy opened his eyes dully. "That's better," said the corporal. "Now, my lad, it's for home." Then he stripped himself of his own greatcoat, wrapped it snugly about the young Indian, and placing the boy on his own horse, he trudged ahead on foot. 5, 10, 15 miles of it, the boy but half conscious and freezing, the man tramping ahead, footsore, chilled through and troubled, the horse with hanging head and lagging step. A strange trio to enter the Indian camp. From far off, old Beavertail had seen the approaching bit of hated scarlet, the tunic worn by the Northwest Mounted Police, but he made no comment as Corporal Menan lifted in his strong arms the still figure from the saddle, and carrying it into the tepee, laid it beside the fire on the warm wolf skins and buffalo hides. It took much heat and nourishment before little Wolf-Willow was able to interpret the story from the Cree tongue into English, then back again into Cree, and so be the go-between for the corporal and old Beavertail. "Yes, my grandfather, Big Wolf-Willow, is here," said the boy, his dark eyes looking fearlessly into the corporal's blue ones. "He's here, as you see, and I suppose you will have to arrest him. He acknowledges he took the cattle. He was poor, hungry, starving. You see, Corporal, he cannot speak English, and he does not understand the white men or their laws. He says for me to tell you that the white men came and stole all our buffaloes, the millions of beautiful animals that supplied us with hides to make our teepees, furs to dress in, meat to eat, fat to keep us warm. So he thought it no harm to take 2 small calves when he was hungry. He asks if anyone arrested and punished the white men who took all his buffaloes, and if not, why should he be arrested and punished for doing far less wrong than the wrong done by the white man?" But, stammered Corporal Menan, "I'm not after him. It is you I was told to arrest." "Oh, why didn't I know? Why didn't I know it was I you were after?" cried the boy. "I would have let you take me, handcuff me, anything, for I understand, but he does not." Corporal Menan stood up, shaking his shoulders as a big dog shakes after a plunge. Then he spoke. "Little Wolf-Willow, can you ever forgive us all for thinking you were a cattle thief? When I think of your grandfather's story of the millions of buffaloes he has lost, and those 2 paltry calves he took for food, I make no arrests here. My captain must do what he thinks best." "And you saved me from freezing to death and brought me home on your own horse when you were sent out to take me to prison," muttered the boy, turning to his soldier friend with admiration. But old Beaver-tail interrupted. He arose, held out his hand toward the once hated scarlet-coated figure, and spoke the first words he had ever voiced in English. They were, "Northwest Mounted Police, good man he, Beaver-tail's friend." End of section 25. End of the Shagganappi by E. Pauline Johnson. Tekahionwake.